When we think about American history, it's so easy to get lost in a list of dates, battles, and presidents. But what if we looked at it a different way? What if we saw it as one single ongoing story? A grand experiment, testing a really radical idea that kicked off nearly 250 years ago. And right there, that's the core hypothesis of the whole thing. Back in 1776, a group of rebels put forward this incredible idea that a nation could be built not on the divine right of a king, but on the natural rights of its people. This was a philosophical earthquake. And that's the central question, isn't it? The entire story of this experiment is really a constant struggle, a push and pull between this beautiful, inspiring ideal and a much, much more complicated reality. Okay, so let's rewind and look at the initial setup. The American Revolution wasn't just about breaking away from England. It was an attempt to design a completely new kind of government from the ground up, one that was supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. Now, what's so revolutionary here is the idea of a government of laws in an age of monarchies. The point was to build a system where your rights weren't a gift from a ruler. They were something you were born with, and the government's job was to protect them. But, and this is a huge but, here's where we hit the experiment's first and probably its greatest flaw. From the very beginning, these incredible words about liberty existed side by side with the brutal reality of chattel slavery, where people were legally property. The phrase, all men are created equal, just didn't apply to everyone, and that created a fundamental contradiction that would haunt the nation for generations. Well, a contradiction like that can't hold forever, and eventually it pushed the entire experiment right to its breaking point. The Civil War, it wasn't just North versus South. It was a battle for the very soul of America. Could a nation conceived in liberty actually survive being half slave and half free? I mean, the scale of this conflict, it's just staggering. This was the moment where the whole thing could have just failed. Completely. The question wasn't theoretical anymore. It was being answered in blood on battlefields from Gettysburg to Vicksburg. But the war's outcome did more than just hold the country together. With the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln fundamentally changed the experiment's goal. What started as a war to preserve the Union became a war to finally start making it live up to its founding promise of freedom. Okay, so after the Civil War, the whole game changes. The experiment's variables, if you will, get supercharged. The new test wasn't just about ideals, it was about sheer scale. The nation was exploding westward and morphing into an industrial powerhouse. And just look at the speed of that change on this timeline. It's breathtaking. In just a handful of decades, the United States went from a bunch of states on the East Coast to a nation that spanned a continent. This idea of manifest destiny, the belief that this was all preordained, drove this incredible growth, but often at a terrible human cost, especially for Native American populations. And it wasn't just land. The Gilded Age saw this economic explosion that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Railroads stitched the country together. Factories were churning out goods. The U.S. became a global economic giant. But all this new wealth also created huge new problems. Intense labor disputes, massive waves of immigration, and staggering inequality that really set the stage for debates we're still having today. All right, so as we flip the calendar into the 20th century, the American experiment faces a totally new kind of test. This time, it wasn't coming from within, but from the world stage. It gets dragged into 2 world wars and then a decades-long Cold War, forcing it to figure out its role beyond its own borders. It's kind of wild when you think about it. During World War II, you have the US and the Soviet Union, 2 completely different systems fighting together against a common enemy. But the second that war was over, boom, they became bitter ideological rivals in the Cold War, a global showdown between democracy and communism that would define the next 50 years. So this led to a new strategy, a single word that would define American foreign policy for nearly half a century: containment. The idea was simple: stop the spread of Soviet influence wherever it might pop up. And that led to a massive military buildup, getting involved in wars like Korea and Vietnam, and this constant, nerve-wracking standoff. And really, the stakes could not have been higher. We're not just talking about one nation's survival anymore. The threat of nuclear war meant the fate of the entire planet hung in the balance. It was a terrifying new chapter for the experiment. But here's the thing. While the U.S. was projecting this image of freedom around the world, the experiment was facing another critical test right here at home.
The civil rights movement demanded that America finally, once and for all, answer that question from 1776. Are all men truly created equal?
This quote, it's honestly chilling to read because it shows you just how deep this inequality was baked into American law. Separate but equal wasn't just a social custom. It was the law of the land, given the stamp of approval by the nation's highest court. It was the legal foundation for segregation.
But that legal foundation, it was dismantled, piece by painful piece. Through landmark court cases like Brown versus Board of Education, incredible acts of courage like the Montgomery bus boycott, and massive demonstrations like the March on Washington, activists forced the American experiment to look in the mirror, confront its own hypocrisy, and inch closer to its founding ideals.
And that, of course, brings us right up to today, because the most important thing to remember is this. The experiment never actually ended. It's still going, still being tested, still evolving as we speak. I mean, just think about the last 2 decades alone. The experiment's resilience has been tested over and over. The shock of 9/11 and the long war on terror, the economic collapse of the Great Recession, and the deep, painful political divisions we see today, they're all fundamental challenges to the nation's stability and its identity. So the questions the experiment is wrestling with right now, they're just as big, just as profound as any it's faced before. How does a nation this diverse stay united when it's so politically divided? How do you ensure everyone gets a fair shot in an era of growing inequality? These are the tests of our time. And that leaves all of us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? This experiment has survived a revolution, a civil war, world wars, and massive social change. But the work is never finished. The future of this great experiment, just like its past, is going to be decided by how each new generation closes that gap between its incredible ideals and its messy reality.